It didn't begin with an explosion. It began with silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of expectation. Every system that watched the sky, military satellites, deep space observatories, civilian networks, registered the same anomaly at the exact same moment. And none of them understood it. At first, it looked like distortion. A ripple in orbit. Then the ripple held. Then it multiplied. What had been empty space just seconds ago was now occupied. Not gradually. Not approaching. Present. Objects, massive, structured, deliberate, appeared in formation across the upper atmosphere. Perfect alignment. Perfect spacing. No heat signatures from entry. No detectable propulsion. No warning. They hadn't arrived. They had simply been there. Within minutes, every global monitoring system was fully engaged. Data flooded command centers. Analysts cross-checked readings. Redundancies confirmed the same impossible truth. This wasn't an error. This was real. The objects didn't move. They didn't broadcast. They didn't react. They held position over key regions, continents, oceans, strategic zones, like markers placed with intention. Humanity watched, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. That was the first mistake. Because the longer nothing happened, the more it felt like something already had. Military forces mobilized anyway. Air defense systems activated across multiple nations. Interceptors were launched, climbing fast toward the unknown structures above. From the ground, they looked small. From orbit, they were not. Each object dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Smooth surfaces, no visible seams, no identifiable weapons. Just massive, silent constructs suspended with impossible stability. The first jets reached visual range. They circled, transmitted everything back. No response. No movement. No sign of life. Command hesitated, then ordered a closer approach. Pilots reported interference almost immediately. Instruments flickered. Guidance systems lagged. Signals broke, reconnected, broke again. But still, no reaction from the objects. No defense. No warning. Nothing. The conclusion came fast. Dangerous, maybe. Hostile, not confirmed. And that was enough. Standby orders were issued. Weapons systems remained locked but inactive. Observation continued. Across the planet, billions of people looked up. Phones recorded. Streams went live. News networks switched to continuous coverage within minutes. Experts filled screens with speculation, experimental technology, classified operations, atmospheric anomalies. No one said the obvious. Not yet. Because saying it would make it real. And no one was ready for that. Time passed. 10 minutes. 30. An hour. Still nothing. No communication. No movement. No escalation. Just presence. And that presence began to change something. At first, it was subtle. A shift in behavior. Emergency protocols stayed active longer than usual. Military commands delayed de-escalation. Analysts kept rechecking the same data, expecting it to change. It didn't. Because the anomaly wasn't in the systems. It was in the situation. Nothing was happening. And that was wrong. Patterns define safety. Cause and effect. Action and reaction. But this had no pattern. No cause. No explanation. And no reaction. The objects weren't waiting. They weren't preparing. They weren't threatening. They were simply watching. That realization didn't come all at once. It spread. Quietly. From analysts to commanders. From commanders to leaders. From leaders to the public. Not through announcements. Through tone. Through hesitation. Through the growing understanding that humanity was not in control of this moment. Hours passed. Then more. Still nothing. But by then, the silence had already done its job. Because the question had changed. It was no longer, what are they? It became, why haven't they acted? And buried beneath that, a deeper one. What are they waiting for? No one had an answer. But somewhere, in systems no human could access, in perspectives no human could see, that question had already been answered. And the delay, the stillness, the complete, unnatural restraint, was not hesitation. It was measurement. Humanity wasn't being ignored. It was being evaluated. Every signal, every movement, every attempt to understand, observed, recorded, understood. And when that process reached its conclusion, when whatever they were looking for had been found, the silence would end. Not gradually, not with warning, but with the same impossible certainty as their arrival. Instant, unavoidable, final. And by the time humanity realized that, it would already be too late. The silence ended without warning. No signal, no build-up, no final moment to prepare. 1 second, the structures in orbit were still. Then if they acted, a line of light formed beneath one of the objects. Not bright at first, focused, condensed, like something being calculated in real time. Ground systems reacted instantly. Alerts triggered across multiple continents. Defense networks locked onto the source. Tracking systems tried to predict trajectory. They couldn't, because it didn't travel. It connected. A beam, perfectly straight, perfectly stable, extended from orbit to the surface in less than a heartbeat. There was no arc, no delay, just contact. And then, a city vanished. Not damaged, not burning, gone. Where millions had been seconds earlier, there was now only a widening absence. Structures collapsed inward as if erased from their foundations. Shockwaves followed, delayed, meaningless against what had already happened. For a fraction of a second, the world didn't react. Because it didn't understand. Then every system on Earth lit up at once. This wasn't an anomaly anymore. This was an attack. Global defense protocols activated instantly. Missile systems launched from land and sea. Fighter squadrons were scrambled in waves. Emergency broadcasts flooded every network. But before any response could reach its target, the second beam fired. Different location. Same result. Another city, gone. No warning. No pattern. No mercy. And then the third. The fourth. Across the planet, the sky turned into a grid of precision strikes. Each beam lasted only seconds. Each impact removed entire population centers with impossible efficiency. There was no randomness in the targeting. But from the ground, it felt completely random. That was the design. Panic spread faster than information. Highways filled within minutes. Communication networks overloaded almost instantly. Governments attempted to issue instructions, but the messages conflicted, overlapped, broke apart. No one knew where was safe. Because nowhere had been proven to be. Military responses escalated. Long-range strike weapons were deployed. Hypersonic systems launched toward the orbital targets. Naval fleets fired coordinated salvos. For a brief moment, it looked like resistance. Dozens of missiles converged on a single object. Tracking systems confirmed impact trajectories. Command centers watched, waiting for confirmation. At the final second, every missile failed. Some detonated early. Others veered off course. A few simply stopped mid-air, as if something had reached into their systems and turned them off. They never made contact. The objects in orbit didn't move, didn't defend, didn't acknowledge the attack. They didn't need to, because nothing humanity launched could reach them. The imbalance wasn't just technological. It was absolute. More beams followed. Faster now. More precise. Key infrastructure disappeared, power grids, data centers, military installations. Entire regions went dark in seconds. Satellites began failing in orbit, one by one, blind to whatever was controlling the space around them. Command centers tried to adapt, recalculate, regroup. But every time a pattern was identified, it changed. Every time a defense was prepared, it was already obsolete. It wasn't just that the enemy was stronger. It was that the enemy was ahead. Boys. Watching every response as it formed. Understanding it before it was executed. Countering it before it could matter. The realization spread through military command faster than the destruction itself. This wasn't war. This was control. Deliberate. Measured. Efficient. They weren't trying to overwhelm humanity. They were demonstrating something. Capability, precision, dominance. And they were doing it in a way that ensured one outcome: complete psychological collapse. Within hours, major governments lost operational control. Emergency leadership protocols failed as key facilities were targeted and removed. Backup systems didn't activate in time, or at all. Chain of command fractured. In some regions, it disappeared entirely. Civilian populations were left without guidance. Local authorities attempted to maintain order, but the scale of destruction made coordination impossible. The world wasn't fighting back anymore. It was reacting. Too slow. Too late. Above it all, the fleet remained perfectly aligned. Untouched. Unchallenged. Watching. The attacks didn't slow down. They became selective. Fewer strikes. More impact. Instead of wide destruction, the beams began targeting specific locations, strategic nodes, remaining centers of coordination, anything that resembled structure. Anything that could become resistance. Was removed. One by one. Until there was nothing left to organize. Nothing left to command. Nothing left to fight with. Still, no communication came. No demands. No explanation. No acknowledgement that humanity even existed beyond the data being collected. That was the most terrifying part, because it meant one thing. This wasn't personal. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't even hostile in the way humans understood. It was procedural, like a system executing a function. Humanity wasn't being attacked out of anger. It was being processed. And as the destruction continued, as entire regions disappeared without a trace, a realization began to take hold, slow and undeniable. Everything humanity believed about warfare, about power, about survival, did not apply here. Because this wasn't a fight. It never had been. And whatever came next wouldn't be about winning. It would be about whether anything was left. When the process was complete, by the time the third phase began, there was no clear moment it started. Because collapse didn't arrive all at once. It spread, quietly at first, then everywhere. Communication was the first to break. Not completely. Worse, inconsistently. Some regions could still transmit. Others went silent without warning. Signals overlapped, repeated, contradicted each other. Emergency broadcasts looped outdated instructions. Military frequencies filled with fragments, partial commands, cut-off reports, unanswered calls. No one knew what information was real anymore. And without reliable information, coordination died. Governments tried to maintain control. Emergency councils activated. Backup command centers came online. Most didn't last long. Some were targeted directly, precise, immediate removal the moment they became active. Others failed from within. Overloaded systems. Conflicting data. Decisions made seconds too late. Leadership didn't fall in a single strike. It eroded until it stopped functioning. Across entire nations, authority became a memory instead of a system. The military followed. Units still existed. Weapons still remained. But without coordination, without command structure, they became isolated, acting on incomplete information, reacting instead of planning. Some attempted counterattacks. Most never reached their targets. Others hit nothing at all. Because the enemy was no longer just above them. It was inside their systems. Targeting feeds glitched. Identification protocols failed. Friend or foe systems returned errors. Entire defense grids locked themselves out of operation. Not destroyed. Controlled. It wasn't chaos. It only looked like chaos from the ground. From above, it was precision. Every surviving structure of control was identified. Evaluated. Then removed. Not all at once. Not violently. Just efficiently. Until nothing remained connected. And once that happened, humanity stopped functioning as a unified species. It became fragments. Cities without contact. Regions without support. People without direction. Panic filled the gaps. Highways became static lines of unmoving vehicles. Airports shut down mid-operation. Hospitals operated beyond capacity until they couldn't operate at all. Supply chains collapsed within hours. Food distribution failed. Water systems shut down in multiple regions as infrastructure disappeared. The basic systems that kept billions alive stopped. Not dramatically, gradually, relentlessly. And the worst part was the waiting, because the attacks didn't come constantly anymore. They came unpredictably. Minutes of silence, then sudden erasure, hours of nothing, then another region gone. There was no rhythm to survive by, no pattern to follow, just uncertainty. People stopped trying to understand the threat. They started trying to avoid it. But avoidance requires rules. And there were none. No safe zones. No warning signs. No logic that could be followed. Every decision became a guess. And most guesses were wrong. In the absence of leadership, smaller groups formed. Local authorities. Civilian efforts. Improvised coordination. For a moment, it looked like adaptation. Until those groups were noticed. Then they disappeared too. The pattern became clear, even without communication. Anything that resembled organization was removed. Anything that could become resistance didn't last. It wasn't enough to destroy infrastructure. They were dismantling structure itself. The idea of unity. The ability to act together. And it worked. Because as the hours passed, humanity stopped thinking collectively. Survival became individual. Then local. Then instinctive. Trust broke down. Movement became dangerous. Staying still became dangerous. There was no correct choice. Only less immediate consequences. Above all of it, the fleet remained unchanged. No visible damage. No repositioning. No urgency. They didn't need to adapt. Because nothing below them required it. And yet, they were still watching. That much was certain. Every failed regrouping. Every attempt at coordination. Every shift in human behavior. Observed. Measured. Understood. Which meant something critical. The destruction wasn't the goal. It was part of a process. And that process wasn't finished. As the last functional command networks went dark. As the final coordinated military responses failed. A realization settled in, not through communication, but through shared experience. Humanity had lost control of its own planet. Not symbolically. Not strategically. Completely. There was no center anymore. No unified response. No global identity. Just scattered survivors reacting to something they couldn't influence. And for the first time since the arrival, a new kind of fear appeared. Not fear of death. That had already come and gone. Something deeper. The fear that this wasn't the end. That everything so far, the silence, the strikes, the collapse, was only preparation. Because if this level of destruction hadn't finished them, then it wasn't meant to. Which meant something else was coming. Something beyond eradication. Something that required humanity to still be here. But broken. And as that thought spread, as the last illusions of resistance disappeared, the sky above remained exactly the same. The attacks didn't stop. They changed. Not in intensity. In purpose. Where entire cities had once vanished in seconds, the strikes now became selective. Slower. More deliberate. Not fewer, but more precise. From the ground, it felt like hesitation. From above, it was refinement. Because destruction had already done what it needed to do. Humanity was no longer organized. No longer coordinated. No longer capable of unified resistance. Which meant something had shifted. The objective wasn't collapse anymore. That phase was complete. But they were watching what came after. Patterns began to emerge, not in the attacks, but in what was being ignored. Some areas were left untouched for long periods. Not because they were hidden. Not because they were safe. Because they were being observed. Small human groups forming in isolation. Survivors adapting without communication. Improvised systems, primitive, fragile, trying to rebuild structure from nothing. And each time something new appeared, something different, it lasted just long enough to be understood. Then it was removed. Not instantly. Not randomly. As if whatever was above was allowing behavior to develop before deciding whether it mattered. That was the first real shift, because it meant one thing. This was no longer just elimination. It was analysis. Humanity wasn't being destroyed blindly. It was being studied. From a distance no one could reach. Through systems no one could see. Every action, every reaction, every adaptation was being recorded. Not emotionally. Not judgmentally. Clinically. Like data. And that realization began to surface, not through communication, but through repetition. The same pattern. Again. And again. And again. Groups that stayed hidden survived longer. Groups that organized were removed faster. Groups that moved unpredictably lasted, just slightly longer than expected. Not long enough to win, but long enough to be noticed. It didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like participation. As if every human action, no matter how small, was part of something larger they couldn't see. Something being measured. Something being compared. The absence of communication became more terrifying than the attacks ever were. Because silence, at this point, wasn't indifference. It was intent. If they wanted to speak, they could. If they wanted to end it, they already would have. So the only logical conclusion left was the one no one wanted to accept. They were choosing not to. Which meant humanity still had a function. Still had value. Just not the kind anyone would choose. High above, the fleet remained perfectly still. But inside those structures, processes continued. Comparisons were made. Outcomes evaluated. Probabilities recalculated. Not based on guesses, but on real-time human behavior. The way humans reacted without leadership. Without communication. Without hope. That was what mattered now. Not technology. Not weapons. Not strength. Behavior. Decision-making under pressure. Unpredictability under collapse. And something unexpected began to appear in that data. Not strength. Not resistance. Something harder to define. Humans didn't behave like other species would. They didn't follow clean patterns. Didn't collapse in uniform ways. Didn't react consistently, even under identical conditions. Some panicked. Some froze. Some adapted in ways that made no logical sense, but worked. Temporarily. That inconsistency wasn't noise. It was signal. And it didn't match the models. Which meant something critical. Humanity wasn't fully understood. Not yet. And for the first time since the arrival, that created a problem. Not for humans. For the ones watching them. Because everything so far had followed expectation. Arrival. Assessment. Elimination of resistance. System collapse. All predictable. All controlled. But this variation in human behavior didn't align. Didn't stabilize. Didn't resolve into something easy to categorize. And that meant the process couldn't move forward. Not yet. More observation was required. More data. More exposure to uncontrolled human reaction. Which is why the attacks didn't stop. They evolved. Instead of removing everything, they began shaping conditions. Pressure points. Environmental stress. Situations designed to force decisions. And then, they watched those decisions. Closely. Silently. Without interference. Unless something crossed a threshold. And when it did, it was removed. The pattern was undeniable now, even without understanding it. Humanity wasn't just surviving. It was being tested. Not as a whole, but as a variable. Each group. Choice. Each outcome. Another data point. Another piece of something larger. And buried inside that realization was a question no one could answer. What happens when the testing is finished? Because if destruction had been phase 1 and collapse phase 2, then this quiet, calculated observation was leading somewhere, toward a conclusion, toward a decision. And whatever that decision was, it would be based on everything humanity had done. After losing everything, above the broken planet, the fleet didn't move, didn't react, didn't reveal anything. But for the first time, they weren't just in control. They were uncertain, and that, more than the destruction, was the first sign that something in this process wasn't going exactly as planned. The data didn't align. At first, it looked like noise. Irregular patterns in human behavior. Outcomes that didn't match predictive models. Reactions that shifted under identical conditions. That wasn't supposed to happen. Not at this stage. By every known metric, the species below had already passed the point where variability mattered. Infrastructure was gone. Command structures were erased. Environmental stability had collapsed. The result should have been simple. Decline. Uniform. Predictable. Final. But that wasn't what the observations showed. Instead, the data kept branching. Small groups behaving differently from one another in ways that weren't just random, but adaptive. Decisions that should have failed sometimes didn't. And decisions that should have worked sometimes collapsed instantly. There was no stable curve. No clean trend. No end state forming. So the analysis deepened. Observation shifted into reconstruction. Instead of just tracking present behavior, the systems began pulling backward through signals, fragments, archived transmissions, recovered networks, anything that still held trace data of human activity before the collapse. Not to understand what humans were doing now, but to understand what they had always been. At first, it was incomplete. Broken datasets, corrupted histories, partial records from destroyed systems. But enough remained. Enough to begin mapping patterns across time. And that's when the first inconsistency appeared. Humanity did not behave like a single system. It never had. Where most species converged, biologically, socially, strategically, toward optimized behavior, humans diverged. Constantly. Different regions developing different solutions to identical problems. Different groups reaching entirely different conclusions under the same pressures. Conflict wasn't an anomaly. It was a constant. Internal contradiction wasn't a flaw. It was a defining trait. That alone complicated prediction models. But it wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next. Because when the systems expanded the analysis further, looking at points of extreme stress in human history, the pattern didn't stabilize. It inverted. Moments that should have caused permanent collapse didn't. Moments where systems failed completely were followed by reconstruction. Not identical reconstruction. Different. Stronger in some areas. Weaker in others. But never static. Never final. Failure didn't end human systems. It changed them. And those changes weren't always logical. Sometimes they made things worse. Sometimes better. But always different. That kind of variability couldn't be modeled linearly. It couldn't be reduced to a predictable outcome. Because every endpoint became a new starting point. And that meant something critical. Collapse, for humans, wasn't termination. It was transformation. That realization forced a recalibration. The current state of Earth, the destruction, the fragmentation, the loss of coordination, wasn't necessarily the end of the species. It was a condition. One they had encountered in different forms before. Scaled differently. Less extreme. But structurally similar. And each time, they hadn't disappeared. They had adapted. Not efficiently. Not cleanly. But persistently. That persistence wasn't driven by stability. It was driven by something else. Something harder to quantify. Because when the analysis shifted from systems to individuals, the data became even less consistent. Some humans broke instantly under pressure. Others continued far beyond expected limits. Some abandoned cooperation. Others formed it under impossible conditions. There was no single behavioral rule. No unified response. Only variation. Extreme variation. And within that variation, outliers. Individuals and groups that didn't just survive, but changed the environment around them. Small changes. Local changes. But enough to alter outcomes. Enough to disrupt projections. Enough to matter. Those outliers weren't dominant. They weren't the majority. But they existed. And they appeared more frequently than predicted. Which meant the models were incomplete. And incomplete models meant unreliable conclusions. So the process slowed. Not the destruction. That continued where necessary. but the decision-making behind it. Because for the first time since arrival, there wasn't enough certainty to proceed to the final stage. The species had not stabilized into a predictable end state. It remained open, undefined, and that created risk. Not immediate, not visible from the ground, but real. Because a species that cannot be fully predicted, cannot be fully controlled, and a system that cannot be fully controlled, cannot be safely concluded. The implication of that was clear. Even if no one below could see it, humanity had not passed the test. But it had not failed either. It had done something worse. It had complicated the outcome. And that forced a new requirement. Deeper understanding. Not of what humans were capable of, but of what they might become under sustained pressure. Which meant one thing. The process wasn't ending. It was escalating. Not in destruction. In complexity. More variables would be introduced. More stress conditions applied. Not to eliminate, but to observe response under increasingly controlled constraints. To see if the variability would collapse into something predictable, or expand further. And if it expanded, then the initial assessment had been wrong. Completely. Because this wouldn't be a species nearing extinction. It would be a species in transition. And transitions were dangerous. High above the planet, the fleet remained unchanged. Still silent. Still watching. But within that silence, something had shifted. Not visible. Not announced. But present. For the first time since the beginning, the outcome was no longer certain. And that uncertainty was entirely because of what humanity was proving itself to be. Not strong. Not dominant. But unpredictable in a way that no system had fully accounted for. And that made them something new. Not prey. Not equal. Something else. Something that required a different kind of response. They adjusted the parameters. Not the visible ones. From the ground, nothing changed at first. The sky remained the same, silent structures suspended in perfect alignment. The pattern of strikes still appeared irregular. The destruction still felt random. But underneath that, the system had shifted. Because observation alone was no longer enough. Human variability hadn't collapsed. It had expanded. So the next step wasn't more data. It was forced outcome. Conditions began to tighten. Not through larger attacks. Through controlled pressure. Regions that had remained untouched for extended periods suddenly experienced targeted disruption. Not annihilation, interference. Water systems destabilized. Power flickered in short, controlled bursts. Environmental conditions shifted just enough to force movement. Not enough to kill immediately. Enough to make staying still impossible. At the same time, other regions experienced the opposite. Stability. Temporary. Artificial. Resources remained intact longer than expected. Structures weren't targeted. Groups had time to organize. To build. To believe they had found something sustainable. And then, at precise moments, those conditions were removed. Instantly. Without warning. Everything gained. Gone. The pattern became clear, though no one could articulate it. This wasn't random survival anymore. This was controlled contrast. Different environments. Different pressures. Different outcomes. All running in parallel. All being observed. The goal was simple. Force human behavior into predictable pathways. Limit variability. Create repeatable responses. Turn chaos into pattern. First, it seemed to work. Some groups began behaving similarly under identical stress. Movement patterns aligned. Resource management followed comparable structures. Decision-making became more cautious, more conservative. The data started to stabilize. Just slightly. Enough to suggest progress. Enough to justify continuation. But then, it broke again. Because just as patterns began forming, outliers reappeared. Groups that didn't follow expected behavior. Individuals making decisions that violated every predictive model. And surviving because of it. Not always. Not consistently. But enough to disrupt the curve. Some abandoned stable zones before collapse and moved into high-risk regions. And lived longer. Others refused to relocate under pressure and adapted instead of failing. Some groups split when cohesion was predicted. Others unified when fragmentation was expected. Every time the system narrowed the range of possible outcomes, humans expanded it again. Not intentionally, not strategically, naturally, as if unpredictability wasn't a reaction, but a baseline state. The models recalculated. Again, and again, and again, each time narrowing, each time adjusting variables, each time attempting to eliminate anomalies. And each time, new anomalies appeared, different ones, unrelated to the previous set, which meant they weren't errors. They were inherent. That realization forced a deeper intervention. If behavior couldn't be guided indirectly, it would be constrained directly. Communication interference increased. Movement corridors were limited. Environmental variables were tightened to reduce options. Fewer choices. Fewer variables. Less room for deviation. The outcomes should converge. The system should stabilize. For a brief window, it almost did. Human groups began making similar decisions under identical constraints. Survival patterns aligned more closely. Variability reduced. The curves started to flatten. Predictability increased. Control, finally, seemed achievable. And then, without warning, it fractured. Not gradually, completely, because even within the most restricted conditions, even when options were nearly eliminated, humans still found ways to diverge. Unplanned routes, improvised solutions, irrational decisions that led to unexpected survival. It wasn't efficiency. It wasn't logic. It was something else. Something the system couldn't compress into rules. And that created a failure state. Not visible from the surface, but absolute within the process. Control had not been achieved. Not because of lack of power. Not because of insufficient data. But because the subject itself could not be reduced. Every attempt to simplify human behavior produced more complexity. Every effort to stabilize outcomes generated new variables. The system had reached a contradiction. To fully control the species, it would need to eliminate variability. But eliminating variability would require eliminating the species itself. And that was no longer aligned with the objective, because the objective had changed. This was no longer just about removal. It was about understanding a system that refused to resolve. And now, control had failed. Not temporarily. Fundamentally. For the first time since the beginning of the process, a boundary had been reached. Not of capability, but of comprehension. And that forced the next step. Not more pressure. Not more restriction. Something different. Because if humans could not be controlled, then the only option left was to confront what made them uncontrollable. Not from a distance. Not through systems. Directly. High above, the fleet remained still. Unchanged. Silent. But within that silence, a decision had been made. The experiment had failed to produce predictability, which meant the next phase would not be about observation or control. It would be about revelation. And when that began, the distance between observer and subject would no longer exist. The shift didn't begin in the sky. It began on the ground. Almost invisible. One group moved when it shouldn't have. Another stayed when every condition demanded retreat. A third did something worse. They coordinated. Not through functioning systems. Not through restored networks. But through fragments. Signals piggybacked on interference. Short bursts hidden inside noise. Patterns repeated just enough to be recognized, but not enough to be tracked easily. Individually, it meant nothing. Collectively, it became structure. Not the kind that had existed before. Not centralized. Not dependent on leadership. Something else. Distributed. Adaptive. Difficult to erase. At first, it went unnoticed. Because it didn't resemble coordination. It looked like coincidence. Isolated decisions producing similar outcomes. Separate groups responding in ways that aligned. But without visible connection. From above, it blended into the existing variability. Just more noise in an already unstable system. Until it wasn't, because the outcomes began to change. Not dramatically, subtly. Groups that should have collapsed lasted longer. Movements that should have failed succeeded more often. Encounters with controlled pressure produced results that didn't match any previous pattern. Not random, not predictable, but consistent in one way. They improved. The models adjusted, assumed adaptation, recalculated probabilities, increased observation intensity, and then they found it. Not the network. Not fully. Just traces. Fragments of signal behavior that didn't originate from the system. Didn't follow interference patterns. Didn't align with controlled communication limits. Something was moving through the noise, using the system, but not controlled by it. That shouldn't have been possible. All communication layers had been mapped, restricted, monitored. Nothing complex should have functioned within those constraints. And yet, something was. The analysis focused, tracking every anomaly, every unexpected success, every deviation that led to survival. And the pattern emerged, not in structure, in behavior. Humans weren't rebuilding the old systems. They weren't restoring command chains. They weren't trying to regain control. They were bypassing it, operating beneath the level the system had defined as functional. Too small to track easily, too irregular to predict, too fast to isolate, each individual action insignificant. Together, they formed something the system hadn't accounted for. A network without a center, without a fixed structure, without a predictable form, which meant it couldn't be targeted the same way. Attempts were made. Regions showing higher survival rates were isolated. Pressure increased. Environmental variables tightened further. Communication interference intensified. And for a moment, the pattern dipped. Outcomes worsened. Signals disappeared. The system corrected. But only briefly, because the response came immediately. Different this time. Adjusted. What had been one method became several. What had been consistent became fluid. The behavior shifted faster than the controls could adapt. Not stronger, faster. Each attempt to suppress the pattern forced it to evolve. Not by design, by reaction. And that reaction cycle was accelerating. The models couldn't keep up. Prediction windows shortened. Accuracy dropped. Control responses arrived too late, or targeted the wrong variables entirely. For the first time, the system wasn't ahead. It was following, and that reversed everything, because the entire process had been built on one assumption: that human behavior could be understood before it fully unfolded. That assumption was no longer valid. Understanding lagged behind action, which meant control lagged too, which meant dominance was no longer absolute. From the ground, nothing about this looked like victory. There were no battles won, no cities reclaimed, no visible turning point, just survival. Slightly longer, slightly more often, but enough to matter. Because above, the shift was undeniable. The data no longer pointed toward convergence. It pointed toward expansion. Human variability wasn't collapsing under pressure. It was increasing, becoming more complex, more adaptive, more resistant to prediction with every cycle. And at the center of it was something the system hadn't identified at the start. Not intelligence, not technology, not strength. Something else. Something that didn't scale linearly, that didn't stabilize, that didn't follow optimization, improvisation, unstructured problem solving under extreme constraint. Not efficient, not clean, but effective in ways that couldn't be pre-modeled. That wasn't supposed to dominate outcomes. For now, to us. And that created the final realization. Not gradual, immediate, because once it became clear, it couldn't be ignored. Humanity hadn't been hiding power. It hadn't been waiting to reveal strength. It had been doing something far more dangerous, adapting in real time, faster than a system designed to control it could respond. Not by overcoming the system, but by operating in the gaps it couldn't fully define. Which meant one thing: the process had reversed. The observers were no longer fully in control of the outcome. They were part of it, reacting, adjusting, falling behind. And for the first time since the arrival, there was something new in the system. Not in human behavior, in the ones observing it. Uncertainty. Not about what humans were, but about what they were becoming. Because whatever this was, it hadn't been part of the original assessment. And it wasn't stabilizing. It was accelerating, which meant the final phase would not be a conclusion. It would be a decision. One that could no longer rely on complete understanding. One that would define whether this species still qualified as something to be controlled, or had become something else entirely. The final phase did not begin with an attack. It began with a pause. For the first time since their arrival, the strike stopped. Completely. No beams. No targeted removals. No environmental pressure. Across the entire planet, the sky remained filled with the same silent structures. But they did nothing. At ground level, the change was immediate. Not relief. Confusion. Because silence now meant something different. Before, it had been the beginning of destruction. It felt like something had ended. But no one knew what. Hours passed. Then more. No regions were targeted. No systems disrupted. The unpredictable pattern that had defined survival disappeared. And in that absence, something else surfaced. Human activity didn't stop. It adapted again. Groups that had learned to move cautiously kept moving. Signals that had formed beneath interference continued. The decentralized patterns of coordination expanded because they no longer had to react to constant pressure. But they could act. Not openly, not loudly, but steadily. The same fragmented communication methods evolved. Signals became clearer, not centralized, but more efficient. Patterns of movement aligned more often. Resource sharing, once risky, became slightly more consistent. Not organized in the old way. Something new. Still without a center. Still without a single point of failure. But undeniably connected. And above, the fleet observed. No longer adjusting in real time. No longer attempting to control. Only watching the outcome of what had already been set in motion. Because the decision point had arrived. The models had reached their limit. Control had failed. Prediction had broken down. And yet, the species remained. Not stable. Not unified. But functioning. Adapting. Expanding complexity under reduced pressure. That outcome forced a final evaluation. Not of strength. Not of threat in the traditional sense. Of trajectory. Where this species would go. If left uncontained. The answer was not clear. Not fully. But one conclusion had become unavoidable. Humanity could not be reduced to a fixed state. It would not settle. Would not stabilize into something predictable. Every attempt to define it changed it. Every effort to control it accelerated that change. Which meant any continued intervention would only increase the very variability the system could not contain. So the final decision was made. Not as a reaction. As a resolution. The fleet did not descend. Did not communicate. Did not issue terms. Because none of those actions aligned with the conclusion. Instead, they withdrew. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. The structures in orbit began to shift position. Slowly at first, so slow it was almost imperceptible. Then faster. Rising. Receding from the atmosphere. Breaking formation with the same precision they had arrived with. No sound. No signal. No acknowledgement. From the ground, it looked impossible. After everything, after the destruction, the collapse, the observation, they were leaving. Not because they were defeated. Not because they were forced. Because they had chosen to. And that choice carried more weight than any attack. Because it meant one thing. Humanity had not been erased. Not controlled. Not even fully understood. It had been assessed. And whatever the conclusion was, it did not justify continuation. The risk of further interaction outweighed the certainty of outcome. So they disengaged. The last of the structures disappeared beyond visible range. Sensors, where they still functioned, failed to track them. Within minutes, the sky was empty. Completely. Silence remained. But this time, it was different. Because nothing followed it. No next phase. No hidden escalation. Just absence. On the ground, humanity didn't celebrate. There was no unified reaction. No global announcement. No clear understanding of what had just happened. Only fragments of realization. They had survived. Not by overpowering the enemy. Not by defeating it. But by being something it could not resolve. Something that did not fit. And that had been enough. The decentralized systems remained. The adaptive patterns continued. Not because they were needed for survival anymore, but because they had become the new structure. Not imposed. Not designed. Evolved under pressure. And now, free to continue. No one declared dominance. No one claimed victory. Because there had been no moment where the balance visibly shifted. No single event that marked the turning point. Just a gradual realization. The ones who had arrived with complete control had left without it. And humanity, broken, scattered, undefined, remained. Not as it had been before. Something else. Something still changing. Still unpredictable. Still impossible to reduce to a final form. And somewhere, far beyond reach, the ones who had observed them carried that conclusion forward. Not as a failure. As a warning. Because the most dangerous outcome had not been destruction. It had been this. A species that could not be fully understood, left to continue becoming something new, unobserved, uncontrolled, unfinished, and that was a variable no system could safely ignore. But no system chose to confront.